So my name is Emily Sessa. I'm an associate professor in the biology department at the University of Florida. I'm a botanist and evolutionary biologist, and I study the evolution of ferns and other plants. I did my undergraduate degree at Cornell, and I worked as the assistant to the director at PRI from 2005 to 2007. And part of my job back then was actually organizing Darwin Day at PRI and Museum of the Earth. So it feels very serendipitous to be here tonight as the moderator of this panel. I have a bit of deja vu, actually. So I'm really excited to hear from all of you, this wonderful lineup of speakers. And I'm going to keep my opening remarks here fairly short so I can move us right along to introducing you all and then getting on to the main event. But I'd like to start with an invitation to everyone here tonight, actually, to do something that can actually help make a difference in the visibility of women in evolutionary biology. So first, a little bit of background, and I'll explain what I mean by this. So it's probably pretty obvious from the topic of the panel tonight and the fact that we're here talking with and about women in evolutionary biology that women evolutionary biologists do exist today, but it may be less obvious that women actually have had a long history of participating in the biological sciences and in evolutionary biology specifically, because for most of the histories of these fields, the participation of women and members of other underrepresented communities wasn't necessarily obvious from the outside. And this is an issue of visibility and representation and has a lot to do with who gets recognition and whose work and ideas and contributions are made visible in the society that we live and work in. And visibility is critically important. You may have heard the phrase, if you can see it, you can be it, which refers to the really profound importance of representation and role models in basically any field, really. So thinking about the visibility of women in evolutionary biology, let me give you some data. This brings some science to this. So from one of the most ubiquitous sources of information for probably most of us, which is Wikipedia. So if you go to Wikipedia and you look at the various categories of topics, there are categories for evolutionary biologists and women evolutionary biologists. There is no category for men evolutionary biologists, which I think is in itself very telling. So clearly Wikipedia doesn't find it necessary to have a separate category for male evolutionary biologists, presumably because they assume that the default is that evolutionary biologists would be men. So that is obviously a problem in itself. If you look in the broader category of evolutionary biologists, there are 369 Wikipedia entries or articles that have that tag, but only 69 entries have been tagged with the category of women evolutionary biologists. So that's about 19% of that broader category. And the fact that this number is so low is really surprising because even historically in biology generally and ecology and evolutionary biology in particular, there has been actually better representation of women than in some of our sister STEM fields like physics or engineering. And biology undergraduate majors in the US are now actually slightly more female than male overall. So there's a really clear discrepancy here between our representation on Wikipedia and the reality of women evolutionary biologists. And if you look at the women who are included in the 69 pages that do have that tag, many of the famous women are actually missing. So for example, Wikipedia pages exist for Jane Goodall and Rosemary Grant and Mary Leakey and Mary Anning, who I think of as being among the really famous women evolutionary biologists, but they're not tagged with the category women evolutionary biologists. And some of the women are actually not tagged in the broader evolutionary biology category. So this means both that they are less visible as evolutionary biologists, and it gives the overall appearance from those numbers that there are fewer women evolutionary biologists out there than there actually are or have been in the past. So we're underrepresented there in quite a few ways. So this is obviously very frustrating, but it's also a place where you can contribute. So it is really easy to become a Wikipedia editor. They have great tutorials. And as you may know, Wikipedia is a community edited and community maintained resource. So any person listening tonight could go and sign up for a Wikipedia account and start building and tagging pages to help correct this particular issue of visibility of women evolutionary biologists on Wikipedia. And a great place to start might be to create pages for our panelists tonight. So one of them, Corey, actually has a page already, which is fantastic, but our other panelists don't, and they should. So if any of you listening want to take up this challenge, I'm going to provide you with your starting material right now by introducing our panelists and then turning things over to them for their remarks. So I'll introduce them alphabetically and be sure to take notes so that you can help go build their Wikipedia pages later tonight after we're finished. So we'll start with Leslie. So Leslie Babonis is an assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Cornell. There she is. She studies the evolution of form and function in animals through the lens of novel traits, and she works primarily with fun marine critters like cnidarians and ctenophores. Victoria Morgan is a 2013 graduate of Cornell's Biological Sciences undergraduate program, and she's currently a PhD candidate at the University of California at Davis. She studies the mechanisms behind major macroevolutionary life history transitions, and she's working in particular on the genetics of land crabs to understand how they adapted to living on land. Next up, we have Corey Moreau. Corey is the Martha N. and John C. Moser Professor of Arthropod Biosystematics and Biodiversity and Director and Curator of Cornell's Insect Collection. Her research is focused on symbioses and how they affect evolution and diversification, especially in insects. Chelsea Specht is the Barbara McClintock Professor in Plant Biology in the School of Integrated Plant Science at Cornell, and she's also the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion in CALS. She is a plant biologist, and her research focuses on the evolution and diversification of plant form and function. And Maren Batusek is an assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Cornell, and she studies the ways that organisms cope with challenges in their environments through phenotypic flexibility, using tree swallows as her lab's main model organism. So with that, I will turn things over to our panelists, and they will each speak for a bit. And then when we're finished, we'll open things up for discussion and questions from the audience. And we'll go in alphabetical order again here. So that would be Leslie up first.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's really an honor to be here among these truly amazing female evolutionary biologists. It's really great to have these people as my cohorts and to have a chance to really speak about some of the experiences that some of us may have and that our broader community has had with regards to this topic of women in science and underrepresentation. So I thought what I would do to kick this off is tell a story about one of the most inspiring women in my field, which is a woman named Ethel Brown. And so just to give you a little bit background, my field, my subdiscipline of evolutionary biology is called EvoDevo, or Evolutionary Developmental Biology. And it's a relatively new field in evolution in the sense that it only came together as a proper named field with a conference and a journal and a really, cohesive group of people around the early 2000s. But I think the thing that EvoDevo really contributes to the study of evolution that was missing up to the point that EvoDevo kind of came around is that communication among cells has a really important function in driving the development of an organism. And so to highlight that, one of the really famous experiments that was done kind of in the framework of evolutionary developmental biology was actually awarded to a man named Hans Spemann in 1935 for identification of a group of cells in an amphibian embryo that are called the organizer cells. And so the thing that's important about these cells is that those cells alone, if transplanted to a new embryo, can induce a completely different, a second axis of an animal. It can actually cause the embryo to form two animals instead of one. And so the point of that is that that group of cells has the ability to induce the cells around it to take on a new identity. So they can control the identity of the cells around them. And there's no way to know that. We would never have known that that was a property of cells or embryos or animals without developmental biology. That's not something that we can learn from studying population genetics, the fossil record, or anything else. And so this is why I say that EvoDevo, I think, has made a really significant contribution to the development of evolution as a field. And so I want to come back to Hans Spemann, who was awarded this Nobel Prize, as I mentioned, in 1935 for the experiment that actually involved the transplantation of that embryonic tissue. However, that experiment was done by a woman, his postdoc at the time, Hilda Mangold. She did that experiment in 1925. And, it was obviously had a huge impact on evolutionary biology and the way we think about animal diversity. But this is actually a story within a story about women not getting credit where they deserve it, because in fact, the original experiment that first identified an organizer as a really important phenomenon in animal developmental biology was done by a woman named Ethel Brown in 1909. So 20 years before Spemann and Mangold ever did that experiment. Ethel Brown did this experiment in Hydra, which is a cnidarian. So it's a group that I particularly love. And she never got credit for this. She was not included in the Nobel Prize, even though she was clearly the first person to describe this phenomenon that changed, that shaped the way we think about evolution. And the thing that's really surprising about this, or really telling about this, is in her manuscript where she published this result, where she identified the organizer, she didn't call it the organizer. She called it a tissue that induced the form of another tissue, or that drove the form of another tissue. And I think that's really important to point out, because I think it really reflects the fact that one of the main challenges that I think women still face in science and STEM is that on average, women have different ways of communicating than men do. And I think communication skills and communication tendencies and personality types is one of the ways that we still see a lot of discrimination and segregation between men and women in sciences. And so I think that story is really telling that women have a huge impact that they have made and continue to make on evolutionary biology, but also that inborn kind of native traits of women can change the way that we are seen in this field. And that's still a persistent challenge that we're going to have to continue to overcome. So I'll end there and turn it over to Vicki.
Hi, I have a presentation, so I'm just going to share my screen now. Cool. Hi, I'm Victoria Morgan, but you can call me Vicky, and I'm really excited to come talk to you today about women in evolutionary biology, but specifically about women of color in our field. So a little about me. I graduated from Cornell's Ecology and Evolutionary Biology department in 2013. And while I was an undergrad here, or at Cornell, I studied marine invertebrate responses to climate change at the Woods Hole Institution as part of the Partnership Education Program. But for the bulk of my honors thesis at Cornell, I primarily studied coral reef snapping shrimp biodiversity and speciation in Bali and Sumatra. Through the Diversity Project, which is a joint effort through the UCLA and the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History and the Indonesian Biodiversity Research Center. And I was also funded to complete that thesis work through Cornell's BioReef Fellowship. And so that's kind of why I'm here today. I was invited by one of the old coordinators of the fellowship. After I graduated, I worked for 2 years at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography as a research tech and a lab manager with Jennifer Taylor. And that's where I really discovered this passion that I had for understanding life history evolution in terrestrial crabs. So for those of you that don't know, those are crabs that live full-time on land. So if you actually took them and put them back into water, they would actually drown. So I took that budding passion that I had for land crabs and developed it into my PhD work. Currently, I am a finishing PhD candidate at in the Population Biology Graduate Group at UC Davis. And throughout my PhD as both an NSF Graduate Research Fellow and an East Asian Pacific Summer Institutes Fellow, I've been able to travel to Christmas Island in Australia, to Singapore, to Japan, and to lots of remote islands in the Zanzibar archipelago to observe and study my crabs in the wild and collect samples for genomic and transcriptomic sequencing. And so it's been an incredible and wild ride. So a few more pictures. One of the coolest crabs that I study is actually the coconut crab. And so I have 2 of them in my hand on this picture in the left. So they are incredible because they can live for 60 to 70 years. Their lifespan can get to be 1 meter long. And they can actually crack open coconuts with these really massive claws that they have in the front of their bodies. So I am just really excited to come talk to you today because I feel like I can offer sort of a unique perspective about women in our field because of my identities. So I'm a woman in evolutionary biology, yes, but I'm also Black. I'm also a child of a single parent low-income household. And in this picture on the left is my mom and my 2 siblings. My mom recently passed away, but everything I do now, I do to make her proud. I'm also the first person in my family to receive an advanced degree, the first person to go to grad school, and this summer I'll be the first person with a PhD, yay. But I'm also disabled and I live my life every day with 2 pretty serious chronic illnesses. So I've had type 1 diabetes for 18 years, and I was recently also diagnosed with congenital hydrocephalus. So the challenges I face getting to where I am in my career and the ones I'll continue to face as I move the ladder in academia go above and beyond the challenges I face as a woman in this field. And I think it's important to realize and acknowledge that challenges that women face in EEB are felt even more acutely by women from historically excluded racial groups, by first-generation female students, by women with disabilities, or women with non-traditional gender identities or sexual orientations, and even more so by women that find themselves in more than one of these categories. So at UC Davis, I'm also the graduate student advisor to the dean for diversity, equity, and inclusion for the College of Biological Sciences. So this intersectionality between different axes of diversity is something that I think about every day. And I also think a lot about how our universities can work harder to attract, support, and retain diverse talent, and different ways that we can remove some of these systemic barriers that make it harder for people like me to succeed in our field. So to prepare for this webinar, I found this paper that came out last year that discussed why diversity is so lacking in our field. And it presented some pretty shocking statistics. So even though African Americans make up 13.4% of the US population, in 2014, which is what this paper was based on, African Americans earn less than 1.8% of all the PhDs in evolutionary biology. And then for reference and for comparison, during that same year, African Americans earned 5.1% of PhDs in other subfields of biology, and then 6.4% of PhDs of any field. So clearly we're underrepresented among all PhD recipients, but this problem seems to be particularly severe in EEB. And I also found a more recent data from the National Science Foundation, so I dug a little deeper, and it presented an even starker picture. So in 2019, African Americans of all genders earned less than 1.2% of all the PhDs that were awarded in evolutionary biology. And then just to put numbers to that percentage, that's 8 people. So in 2019, 8 African Americans earned PhDs in evolutionary biology, 8 people. So I tried to gather a list that I'm sure isn't comprehensive about the challenges that women in STEM fields face, and then the additional barriers that women of color face in our field. So some challenges that women face in succeeding in STEM fields could be a lack of female role models or lack of women in leadership roles. Women tend to, like Leslie was saying, their achievements tend to be under-recognized or they get lower visibility. There's disparities in our participation in scientific societies, academies, and conferences. Women also tend to have additional domestic responsibilities that men don't have. There's systemic implicit bias in how we're evaluated because of our gender. And we also might face sexual harassment in the workplace. And then additional challenges that women from historically excluded racial groups face include, again, this lack of role models, but this time a lack of racial diversity. So lack of role models of color or female or otherwise, or a lack of genuine inclusion or a sense of belonging. In these academic spaces, we might face racial trauma or microaggressions, racial harassment, othering. There's also systemic bias in how we're evaluated and the access to opportunities that we have because of our racial identity. And then there's lack of basic needs support or sufficient financial support that make it harder for people to actually succeed in pursuing these advanced degrees without the financial support. So the bottom line is the face of evolutionary biology is changing, yes. Back when Darwin was around, there were virtually no women that were practicing as evolutionary biologists. And today the field is a lot more balanced. I mean, we could argue about that, but it's more balanced in terms of gender representation. But why didn't that shift also include Black women or women of color in general? So why are racially minoritized women still left behind? So how can we talk about the successes of women in our field in feminism if we aren't also talking about Black women and women of color? So as you can probably imagine, I was feeling pretty discouraged after finding those statistics. So I turned to Twitter for inspiration. So I tweeted this tweet out to my followers in search of other female evolutionary biologists that were Black or women of color. And I got a really great and inspiring response. So I just want to share with you some of their stories, both in honor of Darwin Day and then also Black History Month. So first, there's Roger Arlinger Young, who was the first Black woman to obtain a PhD in zoology from the University of Pennsylvania. And she was awarded that PhD in 1940. And she was also the first Black woman to publish in her field. So her first paper, which was about the excretory apparatus of Paramecium, was published in Science, which I think is awesome. I wish my first paper came out in Science, but she was a trailblazer and a pioneer, and that paper was published in 1924. So she really opened a lot of doors for us. But the first Black woman to actually receive a PhD in our specific subfield was Colette St. Mary from the University of Florida. So she's currently a professor and associate chair at the University of Florida, and she's got some really great research interests. I definitely recommend after this talk, reading some of her papers. She does really great work. And then just try to find ways to incorporate her work in the lessons that you teach in your curriculum to, again, increase that visibility. And also expose people like me to role models so we have people to look up to. And finally, these are some of the other incredible women of color in EEB that I learned about from my Twitter experiment. So feel free to take a screenshot of this slide, and maybe it could be like a Black History Advent calendar. So each day for the rest of February, you could spend like 15 to 20 minutes learning about one of these incredible women and figuring out how you can incorporate their work and their studies into your curriculum or invite them out to speak in your departmental seminars. But for me, on the precipice of earning my own PhD and taking this next big career step as a postdoc, it was honestly so inspiring to learn about all the incredible work that other women of color are doing in our field. So I feel like I'm in great company. So that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I hope all of them will get Wikipedia pages in very short order.
I hope so too.
Thanks so much, Vicki. Corey, you're up next.
So first, I want to thank you for inviting me to present today. What an honor to be among this set of women evolutionary biologists. I feel humbled and inspired already. And Victoria, boy, you are going to be a hard act to follow. But thank you for sort of sharing so many important points that I know many of our viewers are probably thinking about as well. And I really think that both Leslie and Victoria have set the stage well for us to continue these conversations. We've had discussions about visibility and exclusion. And if we sort of think back to even some of the more key findings within evolutionary biology, we can think of very classic and very familiar cases of exclusion. If we think about discovering the structure of DNA, we know that we had exclusion happening right there. Francis and Crick were already excluding a woman scientist who made the key discovery that was the key piece they needed to be able to contextualize everything they were learning. And so I think that we're seeing this happening. We're seeing patterns that are emerging, right? Where women are constantly devalued in their contributions to not just to evolutionary biology. This is happening across academia and really in the STEM fields, right? So science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We know that women are disproportionately represented across STEM fields. And then if we start to talk about all those other intersecting axes of diversity, we know that it's even worse. There's been some recent sort of back of the envelope calculations that have predicted that just if we look at the proportion of men and women, where based on our demographic population within the US, women should be at 50% contributing across any sort of job field. And that includes STEM. The back of the envelope calculations predict at the rate of change, and even though we've gotten better, right, we're being much more thoughtful of acknowledging the contributions of women and encouraging them to join STEM, we're still expecting 90 to 100 years to reach parity. And that's in this more accelerated, awakening period of recognizing that we're maybe unintentionally, but sometimes intentionally excluding these very intellectual minds from joining the conversation. I also like the fact that Victoria set up this conversation about talking about historically excluded in communities as well. Because yes, it's easy to talk about women in science because we can clearly look at our population. We can say we're 50-50. We know that intellectually we're just as equal. And we know that we have the skills and value that we can bring to these conversations. So it's easy to point to and say, why aren't we at 50% contribution? Why aren't we at 50% employment? Why are we earning 86 cents on the dollar for every man in the same position? But we do need to continue that conversation and drag it out and not just think about the axis of women versus men. We know that there's all kinds of other axes of identity, and we have to think about that intersectionality. And so I really hope that everyone walking away today will begin to think about those. Like Victoria, I'm also a first generation college student, first person in my family ever to get a PhD. I grew up super low income, and so it's pretty interesting to think back about what my experiences were and what I actually expected college to be like. I certainly came in as a disadvantage just because of my socioeconomic status and sort of my family's ability to support me. It's not that they weren't proud and they wanted me there. They didn't really know how to support me. And I want you to recognize that there's some interesting data that suggests that first generation students are not only at a disadvantage, which we can all sort of intellectually get our heads around, but there's now data that says that even the second generation of those those parents are still struggling in ways that we are not accommodating within academia. So we really need to step up. And I really want to reiterate some points that have been made, and those include things like we have to not only attract talent, right? We can easily say, all right, we're going to be awesome and bring in lots of amazing people into our programs, but we also have to support them while they're here, and we have to retain them. If we don't make them feel part of the community, we're going to lose the most powerful minds to other organizations and institutions that are going to value them. And so I hope that all of us will think about ways that we can support the communities we're engaged in, but also make actions and steps. And so, clearly Emily's laid out a very thoughtful and low-hanging fruit option to sort of, promote the diversity of people who are contributing to evolutionary biology. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much for being here with us today. And I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists.
Thanks, Corey. That was wonderful. Chelsea, we've got you up next.
Okay, we're going to see if my internet can hold through this. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. Well, like everyone else, I just want to thank you guys for inviting me to be here, and then also say thank you guys for just being part of this conversation. It's such a it is really a humbling experience, and to be able to think through all the experiences that we've been through and kind of relate those into come and ensure that the next 100 years don't look like the last 100 years, right? So I was thinking about this from the perspective of being a botanist. So I'm a plant evolutionary biologist, I'm a botanist. I do actually have a Wikipedia site. It's just in Spanish, so it doesn't always come up when you do the general Wikipedia Google. But the as a botanist, you think, well, this in natural history, it was okay for women to be picking flowers and looking at flowers, and so you would think that this would be kind of the most inclusive community that you could find. The International Botanical Congress was happening in China that year. And they announced the 30 plenaries and keynote speakers, 30 speakers. This is an International Botanical Congress. All of the speakers were male, and 2 were individuals of color. They did not represent global diversity in people of color, however. And so this was in 2017. And you can think, I mean, now we're in 2021, we should be even doing better than that. But it was a real shock at that time to realize that there's so many, we know that there's a lot of women, there's women in leadership roles, but why aren't they recognized? And it really highlighted the fact that bias is the default. And if nobody is aware, then those women, this is why we have marginalized and minoritized communities in science, because these biases are functioning as this default. So I went back at that time, and I was giving the address for the presidential address for the American Society of Plant Taxonomists. And so I decided to look through their leadership positions to understand better who had served in leadership roles. And I can tell Vicki right now that there are no people of color that have served in our major leadership roles as president, secretaries, in those roles. And also the other place where women and people of color are missing are the major awards given by those by that society. And so I tried to explore that a little bit more, and started to appear. And for the case of American Society of Plant Taxonomy, it was founded in 1937. Mildred Matthias, who's one of my botanical heroes, was the first woman to join the council, which happened in 1957. And in 1964, she became the first female president of the American Society of Plant Taxonomists. So it took 27 years to get a woman into the main leadership role for that society. The second woman joined council in 1975. So quite a few years later, 11 years later, and that was Pat Holmgren, and she became president in 1990. So 26 years after Mildred Matthias was president, we have Pat Holmgren as president. Interestingly, in 1991, there was another female president, Melinda Denton. And in 95 and 96, we had back-to-back Beryl Simpson and Shirley Tucker. Shirley Tucker being a amazing, another one of my botanical heroes, especially as a both Evo developmental biologist and a lichenologist and a plant systematist. So at that time then in the 90s, once you had women in these leadership positions, you started to see the council diversifying. All roles started to be filled by women. And also this is coincident when you started to see women winning the major awards of those societies. Start to serve in leadership roles as leaders, they then they expand the network to increase that visibility, which doesn't bode well for people of color in our institutions, as they're not yet represented in those leadership roles. So you don't see that representation trickling down into the major awards. And we know that awards, publications, and leadership roles are the way we get tenure and the way we get promoted. And we also are familiar with, we tell our students all the time about the Rolling Stone. You know, you get one award, you get another award, you get one grant, you get another, and it rolls and it accumulates. Well, if you can't get that first one, if you can't get that foot in the door, and if you don't have anyone who is looking out for you as an advocate, and if there's not intentionality, then the biases dominate. And we know what the biases do. They give us 100 years of no women in these major fields. So there's a relationship between visibility and between performance and between environment. And advancement in a field is achieved by the movement through that cultural nexus. And it's reflected in the relationships and the networks that we all represent within that environment. And so one of the other things that I was thinking about at that time was this idea of, we have an H index that tells us who we're citing, who we're publishing with, and how well we're cited, who's citing us. And when we also can look at our publications and we can look at who we're publishing with, what is our balance index? What is our gender balance index? Are we publishing with women? Are we publishing with men? Are men mostly publishing with other men? And I've encouraged everyone to do this and look at their publications through time and see how their colleagues and their publisher, who they're publishing with, is reflecting of the diversity of our society. Because these are the networks that are creating the future of academia. And we know that publications are critically important to our visibility, and again, to serving in leadership roles and winning awards. So we have kind of a narrow rubric, if you will, of what success looks like. And if we're excluding people from the networks that create that success, then we can't expect to be able to diversify our fields. And so I encourage everyone to think about ways as individuals you can diversify your own networks. Who are you inviting for seminar speakers? Who are you publishing with? Who are you introducing your graduate students to? And who are they then engaged in publishing with? Does it always have to be you, or can you bring them out to other networks that can advance their careers in ways that maybe you have limitations to being able to do? And so I just want to go back to and end with a story of the Linnaean Society. So I looked at this through the societies, and Sandy Knapp, who was the 2019 became president of the Linnaean Society. And that society is the oldest active society devoted to natural history. It was founded in 1788. There have been 3 female presidents. And the first one in 1973 was Irene Manton, Diane Edwards in 2012, and then Sandy Knapp in 2019. And Sandy Knapp gives this great presentation called Fieldwork in a Fancy Dress, a Natural History of Women in the Field. And I encourage everyone to go to the Linnaean Society page and look at that. But she talks about Jeanne Barré, who was a woman. And the way that she got into the field was to dress up like a cabin boy and get on a voyage of de Bougainville so that she could collect plants. And I think about the fact that she had to dress up like a man to be able to collect plants. That she eventually got found out and they didn't kick her off because she was doing a good job. And after all, it's botany and women can do that. But we really shouldn't make people have to dress up like others in order to be successful in our field. And so I will leave it with that. And thank you all again, and pass it on to Maren.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Chelsea. And just like everyone has said, I'm really honored to be here on this panel today and talking with so many incredible evolutionary biologists. As Emily mentioned earlier, my research focuses on how organisms cope with stress and how stress responses have evolved. And in thinking about how to prepare for this panel, I did some reflecting on my perception of how women in science, of how those perceptions have shifted over time, kind of as my career has progressed. I'm someone for whom a passion in science and nature came early. As a kid, I was fascinated by all kinds of living creatures and also by collecting data and detecting patterns to figure out how the world worked. And for me, the possibility of turning those passions into a career as a biologist was actually something that I thought about from the time I was quite young. I'm not a first-gen college student or academic. In fact, I was really fortunate to be surrounded by women who were pursuing various types of ambitious and successful careers, going back many generations. My grandmother is one example. She was a real trailblazer in her field. She had initially planned to stay home and raise the kids while her husband went to law school. And after 2 days, she decided that wasn't going to work for her and marched into the dean's office and said, I want a place in the law class. And this was the 1940s, so that kind of a thing was possible then. And and the rest is history. She went on to be a judge in the first female head of the family court in Hawaii. So unlike the situation that many women have faced, I was really raised with the expectation that I would have an ambitious and successful career, and that I could do that while raising a family. And I'm very grateful for that experience during my formative years. But I think perhaps because of my upbringing, issues of gender in science were very much not on the screen for me through college and initially through much of graduate school. I was aware that most of the senior faculty members in my field were male and were white, but I think at the time I assumed that that really just reflected the shifting gender roles over time, and that in 20 years, things would be really approaching parity. And I think the first experience that gave me pause was when I was preparing to do some field work in the Galapagos when I was a graduate student at Princeton. I studied marine iguanas, absolutely fascinating reptiles. A single marine iguana species rafted over from the mainland to Galapagos and subsequently diversified into 3 different species out there. Marine iguanas are the one that I did my PhD work on, and they are fascinating animals. They dive down to the bottom of the sea to eat seaweed on the rocks, and they can stay underwater for up to an hour. Really cool animals. But this work involved being on an uninhabited island for about 3 months at a time. So I'd get dropped off, and I had a couple of undergraduate assistants that would come out there with me. And so my first year, I solicited applications for this. And it turned out that for whatever reason, the applications that came in from women were a lot more competitive than those from men in that year. They had more science experience and more outdoor experience. So I chose my assistants and went into a senior faculty member who had a long history of working there and said, hey, these are the folks I want to have work with me. And they said, that's not a good idea. Even though the female applicants were more qualified, it was important that I have a man on the team for safety reasons, because a group of women on an uninhabited island would be perceived as targets. And I think part of me completely understood the practicality of that advice, but I think another part of me really bristled at the idea that a man would be given this incredible opportunity, not because they were more qualified, but because they were male. And I think that was the first time I really thought about how gender identity affected opportunity and how seemingly kind of little things like that could really affect advancement in field biology. And then I think the first time I began to think more broadly about the issues facing women in science was shortly after graduate school, when many of my female peers, these brilliant, dedicated, creative women, began leading science at quite high rates. And these were people with PhDs in evolutionary biology from great programs with great careers, and they were leaving science entirely. And this puzzled me. And of course, this pattern is not unique, as we've already been talking about. We're still losing many more women than men from the field of evolutionary biology in the years after they get their PhDs. And so while I think we've made enormous progress as a field in increasing representation from women, really enormous progress over the last generation. My early impression that the gender imbalances at higher levels of the field kind of still reflected these historical legacies is also not the case. And one of the things that I think we are doing a lot better now is trying to understand why this is the case and mitigating it. Right? And there are many, many reasons, a number of which have been highlighted by other panelists. One of them is certainly the cumulative effect of kind of the slight differences in opportunity based on gender that I was unfortunately a part of perpetuating in graduate school. But I think another very important issue that we haven't yet touched on that seems to be affecting career advancement for many women is motherhood, is raising a family. Many of the brilliant women that I know that left evolutionary biology did so in part because of challenges related to being a mother and an academic. And as a mother myself to two wonderful girls, I certainly understand the challenge of balancing parenthood with a demanding career. At the same time, we also know that that's not the only challenge facing mothers in science, right? Some really interesting research has been revealing that we have implicit biases against women who are mothers, far more so than the implicit bias facing men for becoming fathers, right? And so I think we also really need to think about the ways that we can continue and to support people through various facets of their life who may be raising families or choosing not to. So in short, I think we've come really, really long way in evolutionary biology. Just looking at this panel, we have so many inspiring and amazing women who are evolutionary biologists. And so generally, I think the future is really bright, but like in so many areas of science and in academia, we still have some work to do to continue to support and retain excellent women. And while the sort of umbrella of this panel discussion is focused on women in evolutionary biology, I think it's extremely important to continue to diversify the field of evolution in other ways, right? As Vicky was speaking about earlier, incorporating the perspectives of people with all gender identities and people of color and other axes of diversity.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for your really thoughtful and wonderful comments. It's really inspiring to hear from all of you and to be here with you guys tonight. So I think at this point, we can open things up to questions from our audience. And I've got a few here. I've been taking notes since we've been going along. So I have a few things that maybe could get us started. If audience members want to use the Q&A function at the bottom, you can go ahead and put questions in there, and then we'll see them on our end. I mean, some really major themes came out tonight, right? Like a lot of you have touched on thinking about retention and support once women are, sort of at any career stage, once women are kind of into the pipeline of being professional evolutionary biologists. The importance of intersectionality and thinking about various axes of diversity, of course, really critical. And then also things that we can do to help combat some of these issues that all women face in evolutionary biology. So I'm wondering if maybe we could start by thinking about whenever I think about the issue of intersectionality, and particularly of women and women of color, I'm always caught between wanting to have women of color and women in general in these leadership positions and contributing, but then I also find myself really concerned about the issue of burnout. Like, we know that this is a thing that, women predominantly are performing this, the kind of caretaker roles in departments. So like, female graduate students will come to female faculty when they are having any number of issues, even if their own advisors are male, right? So women are sort of disproportionately doing the service role roles and providing support for graduate students, and a lot of ways that are really hidden. Like those are not things that necessarily you're going to be able to put on your CV. So service roles you might be able to, but a lot of these other kinds of things are not things that we would normally get recognition for. And that's true for women. And I think it's even more true for women of color. And so I really find myself struggling in my department with things like committee assignments between not wanting to overburden the women and the one woman of color. So Vicki mentioned Colette St. Mary, who's in my department. She's wonderful. So we want to make sure that we're not overburdening those people, but we also want them to be represented. And so I'm just curious if any of you have thoughts about how to balance those two things. How do we have women and women of color in leadership, visible leadership positions without overburdening them and burning them out?
One thought I had is that we know that we often expect marginalized identities, whatever they are, to be performing at the same level across all axes. Yet in things like service, whether it's service we can identify and put on our resumes or CVs, or whether it's not, we expect them to do double or triple. But I want to go back a moment and saying, we say that we want them to be doing, equal, but the majority of what we're doing as scientists is research. And there's been numerous studies that have already demonstrated that we actually expect women's research to be fundamentally more rich, to be considered equal with a male's work. We expect significantly more experiments to go into it than a male's work to be published in the same journals. So if we're saying that we want them to have, that we don't want to burden them with too many leadership roles and service roles, yet we're expecting more from them in other categories, suddenly this is sort of, it's compounding the problems here. And so we need to recognize that, when they've done these studies where they've anonymized names and looked at, who contributions to research, when you change a woman's name where it's not gender identifying, their research is valued and likely to be published at the same rate as men. So there's some inherent bias that's happening there across many axes. So it's not just in sort of like who we want to see at the table. We're actually asking them to do twice as much work in the other corners of their job obligations. And so I think we need to think about all of those things at once.
That's a really good point, Corey. I once had a friend when I was in grad school who said to me, well, you have just as much a chance to succeed as a guy does. You just have to work harder. And I thought, well, at least he's being honest about it, But there's also the double-edged sword in that there is inherent joy that comes from doing particular type of service work, whether it's teaching, whether it's mentoring, whether it's being the president of society, whether it's working on DEI initiatives that have a particular focus. And so I also think we need to kind of almost have a development plan for individuals that are coming into academia and say, what do you want to do? I mean, maybe saying, oh, you should focus on your research, that's the way you get tenure, is really quite toxic when that person would really get a lot of personal enjoyment in their career from developing a new course that it uses inclusive pedagogy, which is going to take more time to develop, but will contribute to not only their career development, but also their personal success. And so creating rewards that compensate people for the work they do in their areas of joy is really critical. And rather than seeing service as an automatic taking away from what you should be doing.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add to both of those points are excellently made. I too think that evaluation needs to be changed because like Corey was saying, you have to work twice as hard to get the same level of achievement. But then for people who have these multiple axes of diversity, you also have to overcome 4 times the barriers, that other people have to overcome to get to the same place. And so it's like the playing fields are uneven. So if we change how, we're evaluating success in science, I think that could help us get some of the way there.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all for those thoughts on that. We do have some questions coming in from the audience, so maybe we can shift over to those. So the first one of these is, how do you address pay inequity when academic employers keep pay data secret? So that's a really interesting question. And for folks who might not be kind of familiar with what this issue is about, I'm going to interpret a little bit what I think this question might be getting at. So often in academia, when we are offered jobs, we negotiate for our salaries, and there have been a lot of stories and actually some papers based on data to show that men in general negotiate more, they negotiate harder, they sort of are willing to push the negotiation process longer to the point that they ultimately have higher starting salaries. And so that can exacerbate the difference in pay right from the beginning. And a lot of institutions, especially private institutions, private universities, don't make those their pay data public. So this is a really great question. I don't. Do any of you have thoughts on this? How can we try to address inequity in salaries and pay?
Sorry, I was struggling to find my unmute button there for a minute. I actually do have a comment on this. I don't know how to fix the problem really across the board, but having just come off, I just started at Cornell a month ago. So I'm, just a year ago was on the job market and did 5 interviews and had a few offers at various different universities. And one of the places that I got an offer offered me a startup package that was competitive for what was happening for people in my field for, coming on the job market last year. And when they heard that I had another offer from Cornell, the office of, I can't remember the name now, but it's the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity put up an extra, they matched the offer. They basically doubled the startup that the university was offering to me, because that money was set aside specifically by an endowment to try to recruit women and underrepresented groups to the university. And so this is obviously not something that we as, academics or professors or anything else can do, but I think that universities can do a better job of distributing the way that money is allocated to try to recruit people. I mean, we do this for graduate students, right? The universities come up with various different sources of funding for fellowships to try to recruit truly outstanding graduate students to our department. And I think in as much as it's possible, if there are ways to redistribute funds so we can really try to recruit and retain, as Corey was saying, as multiple people have said, that, excellent faculty from these different backgrounds, that's a really appealing tool that we can try to use to fix that problem a little bit.
Great, thank you. The next question was from Audrey Warner. The previous one was anonymous. The next is from Audrey, and she asks, what advice would you give to documentary filmmakers and journalists working within the evolutionary biology field and within science in general? How can we help to get research out to the larger science community and the general public so that it can have the largest impact possible and make the most change? So what advice would you have for journalists and documentarians?
Call us. No, that's a really interesting, because I often feel like within the university setting, they pick stories that they're going to then put forward. And you don't always know what the criteria are that they're using to pick those stories. And you say, my grant was really cool too. How come that got that one got highlighted and mine didn't? And I think just in general, there are, as with women in various fields, like sort of seeking out that opportunity, you might not be as aggressive in seeking out the opportunity or making that a relationship with a filmmaker or somebody to say, here are some, here's something that we could work on. But I know that the Paleo PRI just did the really great book on the women, women digging. I'm getting the title wrong, and Warren should come on and yell at me for that. But so women paleontologists, and it's just fantastic. And I think that even if filmmakers could come up with the ideas of people, of groups that they want to highlight or things that they want to do, and then find the people, maybe through our Wikipedia pages or whatever, or through the societies to highlight that, I think there's a lot of people who'd be really eager to be able to serve as real role models and representatives in that way.
I really love this question because I really think a lot about representation and opportunity, especially in the lens through which the public thinks about science. And we already know there's a bunch of barriers there, that we know that there's implicit bias that's happening in how women are represented. And so of course, as a documentary filmmaker or as a journalist, think about who are you interviewing, who are you including in your piece, and not just who number wise, but what roles are you assigning them? So if you're doing a piece on evolutionary biologists, are you showing all of these like men doing the sort of roles that we traditionally think of? So, you know, maybe doing field work and climbing mountains, and then you're having women teaching in a classroom. You know, also think about how you're portraying these individuals in your pieces. There's a whole bunch of us out there would give, you know, have any opportunity to share the things we get excited about. If you ever want to talk about bugs and ants, you can call me any day. I will be happy to chat. And I know that my colleagues on this panel feel the same way. And so really, we just want the general public to see that scientists don't have to be, you know, essentially old white men with crazy hair like Einstein, that they look like us. This is what science looks like. And, you know, we want to make sure that that's reflected in sort of how the public is consuming science as well. So anyway, I think you have a free pass to contact any of us anytime.
And I definitely want to add to that. So I love field work, and like I have, like I said, disabilities that make it a little bit more complicated when I go out into the field to, you know, go to these remote islands. But it's something that I love doing. And so whenever I'm out in the field, I try to like have blogs going and post about my experiences just so people can see that, you know, me as a role model, as a Black woman, I'm out in the field doing this incredible research in, you know, far-flung corners of the world, and other people can do it too. So I am totally down to talk about crabs with anybody. So yes, I think there's also a really good resource called Diversify EEB. That is a big link or a big database of different diverse scientists in our field. So maybe if you're looking for people to talk about certain types of science, you can just dig through there and find people to connect to. But yeah, I definitely think it's worth it to put the work in to find, you know, diverse voices for some of these topics.
Vicki, maybe we can stick with you for the next question, which Julie had, which was specifically for you. So she thanks everyone for hosting the webinar. And she wants to know, she says she's a fellow type 1 diabetic looking into graduate school. And do you have any advice for her on how to remain successful and financially stable despite chronic illness?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that question, Julie. And I think it's something that's, you know, important. And I've had people come and talk to me about like how my story is inspiring because they have, you know, disabilities that are like mine and they've never imagined that they could do the things that I've been able to do. So one thing that I think is important is just making sure to have like, to know yourself and to take breaks when you need it. So sometimes like my blood sugars aren't doing what they're supposed to do and I get, you know, really tired, and just having that honesty with myself and then this really supportive relationship with my advisor to say, hey, you know, I'm having a rough day, or hey, this is going on in my health, I need time. It has really helped me be successful in graduate school, and just, you know, taking the breaks when I need it. In terms of the financial component, yeah, being diabetic is very expensive. And as a graduate student on a graduate stipend, it has often been hard for me, you know, to make sure I have all of my supplies or money enough for supplies and, you know, other necessities. But then there are lots of programs out there. So like for insulin, for example, there are like savings plans that you can sign up for that can make the insulin more affordable. If you use a pump like I do, so I have the Medtronic pump, you can also work with them to have like payment plans to make it more affordable and not so much of a burden. Takes a little bit of creativity, but if you have any questions about this, I'm so happy to chat with you offline. So you can contact me on Twitter or email, and I'd be happy to like share my story and give you tips, because I feel like we can do it. So don't let the diagnosis, you know, stop you from achieving your dreams.
Thanks so much, Vicki. Our next question is from another anonymous questioner. So this person wants to know, what is one piece of advice that you would tell burgeoning women evolutionary biologists? So what has kept you persisting despite the difficulties, and any specific resources you would like to share? I love the one piece of advice that you would give question.
I guess I would say be persistent and don't lose the joy in what you're doing, right? We're all here because we're passionate about what we do. Probably first we were passionate about our research, or our critters. But you know, as Chelsea was alluding to earlier, I think we've all probably developed other passions in service, in teaching, that keep us going during the day. And so while there's certainly challenges, you know, I personally wake up every day feeling lucky to be in this job and working with these incredible colleagues. So don't lose sight of that, even when there are bumps in the road.
Yeah, I'm gonna reiterate that about finding that bit of joy, and making sure you stay that with you, because especially when you're getting, there's just so many ways that you can get brought down. There's so many opportunities for rejection, whether it's the job. I mean, we, as a postdoc, I was in a bunch of lab with a bunch of other postdocs, and we had all of our rejection letters like hung up on bulletin boards, and we would like make comments on them to keep it kind of fun. And you know, the grant, it's like this job has a lot of no's, right? You don't get the job, you don't get the grants, you don't, there's a lot of demoralizing opportunities for demoralization. And so one of the things that I find helps is also not being afraid to share those. If there's somebody, you know, if okay, I didn't get this, and there's going to be people out there who are going to be willing to kind of commiserate with you, or you know, talk with you about ideas when you're ready to start hearing ideas, after you've just heard the, oh, that's too bad, you know. But find a community that and particularly collaborators that are enjoyable to work with. Don't think you have to work with somebody because they're the best at this or the most engaged. You know, find the people that you find joy in working with and have those as your collaborators, because they're the people that are going to make it enjoyable and fun and kind of keep the energy going through the down times.
Chelsea said almost exactly what I wanted to say. I'll just say it like slightly more specifically too, that I think this especially applies at the graduate school level. You don't have to stay in the lab that you're in if it's not the right environment for you, even as much as leaving your project behind. The actual project that you work on in graduate school, I think hopefully a lot of you would agree with me, is actually irrelevant to the rest of your life, right? Graduate school is about learning how to think, and it's about learning who you want to become as a scientist. And if you're in a lab where you're not being supported and you're not getting the interactions that you need, you know, from a male advisor or a male graduate student or anybody else, just leave, go somewhere else. There's 1,000 other places where you can become the scientist that you are meant to be. And I am not trying to pretend like that is an easy decision to make or will go very smoothly for you and will not disrupt your life in any way. But you should do it because we need women in science. And the way to succeed is to find yourself in a supportive environment where you can become the person that you should be.
Moving on to our next question. So someone wants to know, how much of an old boys club do you feel exists in academic leadership and scientific societies? Chelsea gave us a little bit of insight into this in the botanical world.
You know, it's interesting because when I was a graduate student and dating myself, that was in the 90s, it very much felt like an old boys club. I was fortunate to have an advisor who was male, and he told me, he's like, well, who are your role models? And I had to say, you know, I don't really have any, because I didn't see anybody who was doing what I felt like I wanted to do. There were women, but they were doing things a little bit differently. And I didn't, fortunately, I found those role models, and we're now became friends with them, and I've lost some of them, and you know, but it's really it seemed like it was a real old boys club at that time, and I feel like it's gotten better. But the only reason I feel that is because I've become part of those networks, and I've created the collaborators and the networks that I needed. And I think that it might not be old, it's old anything club, right? As soon as something's a club, that means there's an in-group and there's an out-group. And in any of these groups, in any field, in any society, there's going to be an in-group and an out-group. Even as things start to diversify, women can be part of that old boys club just as easily as men can. And so it's about finding the group of people that will be, that are like-minded with you, and can break apart those, that share your values and can break apart those cliques.
Anybody else want to speak to that in one of your other fields? Or we can move on. Okay. So our next question then is about diversification of syllabi. So Katie Madison says that diversification of syllabi is an important step in expanding representation of minority STEM professionals in academia. But for members of the general public that are not engaged in this level of academia or are avid consumers of documentary media, how can representation be increased? So children's books like PRI's Daring to Dig that Chelsea mentioned a little while ago, that book and museum exhibitions and things come to mind. So do any of you have suggestions for other ways that folks can increase their intake of diverse folks in evolutionary biology?
I think social media really helps. Like even just for me, like doing this exercise in preparation for the talk of like sending out this tweet and seeing what came back, I think was really affirming, because before I did that, it was really hard for me to think off the top of my head of one Black woman of science or Black women in our field, and so being connected, through, social media and just science communication, I think is really important. And so I try to be active, on Twitter and with my blog about what I'm doing. So I think that's one way that we can help do that. And then also, I know there are lots of programs where, scientists go into classrooms and talk to people about their experiences, or Skype with a Scientist is another program that I think is really important for just showing that, we're out here and we're doing really cool work. And like, even if you're not like in the academic setting, there's a way that you can sort of be plugged into, this diverse side.
I just add, I think being aware and knowing that you should be thinking about this is a great first step. If you have small children in home and you're realizing that every one of the science books that you're sharing is all biased in some way, just become aware of that and start to look for other resources. I don't think there's like a simple solution. If there was, we would have done it, right? And so I think we have to sort of be creative and be aware of what kind of material we're engaging with and what we're sort of sharing out, and making sure that it is reflective of the diversity of people and perspectives that we have across our awesome field.
I'll just second Vicky's comment about social media. I mean, you don't have to be a Twitter user to go to Twitter. And starting last summer, there were a ton of hashtags that focus on Black botanists, and there was Black Birders Week, there's Black in STEM, there's Black physics folks. So there are some really great hashtags that you can search for on Twitter very easily and find lots of people who are tweeting using those various hashtags. So that's a great place to start. Let's see. Question from Anna: how would you suggest to make field work more accessible to people with disabilities? Also, are there REUs available specifically for people from community colleges or people with disabilities? So from what she's heard, it's hard to get for people to get research experience and get into graduate school, and I'm imagining that those opportunities could be exacerbated if you're living with a disability. Maybe Vicky, could you speak to that?
Yeah, so I would definitely say that, like I was saying, fieldwork was very challenging with, I had to go to Christmas Island. I was there for 2 months. I had to bring all the supplies I needed to be safe in the field, and then a way to communicate just in case like I got in a bad spot when I was out in the field. So I think there are lots of ways that you have to think about, like making it more accessible for people with disabilities. I know that there are some departments at universities that, talk about field safety. I'm not sure if they have a specific arm that deals with disability, but I think they definitely should, because a lot of that stuff I just had to, think of on my own or with my advisor, of how to like be in the field and be safe with, the conditions that I have. So I can't think off the top of my head like any resources that are really out there, and I feel like that's something that definitely needs to be developed, because it shouldn't be that hard, So I think maybe starting with this community aspect, building this community of people who do have, are living with disabilities, and talking about like different ways that we've been able to make it work, I think is a good first step.
I just want to add that there's lots of opportunities for people, through things like REU. So if you're not familiar with an REU, it's for undergraduates to gain research experience, usually at another institution, so that they can get a new perspective, learn new tools. And I know that there are lots of REUs that would have no problem accommodating people with disabilities, some being field work and some being more lab-based work. But I think exposure to techniques is really important. And going back to the question specifically about community college students, I know for a fact there are REUs that are specifically to get community college students doing research. So I think there's a way to search and filter within the NSF's REU database. I happen to know that my alma mater, San Francisco State University, has an REU program specifically to get community college students into research labs at their university. So that's just one I know of, and I'm sure there's many more. And so, you know, if you don't apply, you're not going to get an opportunity to participate in these programs. And they're really fantastic.
Great, thank you both. So another question. This one is going along with what Maren brought up earlier. Like many women, this questioner had a desire to pursue a career in evolutionary biology, but ultimately decided to get a master's in science education because the schedule of being an educator aligned better with raising 2 children as a single mom. So she wants to know if you think it's still possible to enter back into field work and pursue a career at an older age, and what is the best way to get back into the pipeline of professional women in science?
I think it's wonderful to hear about women thinking about re-entering the field. And I would say that's absolutely possible. Many people begin PhD programs after taking a period of time off. And I think it's particularly common in ecology and evolutionary biology. Most of our students in the EEB program at Cornell have taken a little bit of time off after college to pursue opportunities. I think it's not uncommon to have PhD students who've taken far more time off for a variety of reasons. So it's absolutely possible, and I also think that's a good time to have a career break. It's a little bit harder if you finished your PhD to then take a lot of time off and then sort of get back in. So I mean, as far as sort of how to go about doing that, I think the biggest barrier is often just getting back into the field, figuring out what sort of the current questions are and who the players are, who you might want to be doing your PhD with. Twitter, again, is, I think, an increasingly excellent place to sort of get the lay of the land and hear about interesting and exciting results. And look around, follow networks of scientists, check out talks that people have given online, and figure out what kinds of labs and programs you might be most interested in fitting into, and then reach out to those people, see if you can set up a time to talk with them, and whether they might be interested in accepting a student with your experience. So I wish you all the best of luck.
Thanks, Maren. Yeah.
I was gonna say, one thing to think about there too is, you know, when you talk to graduate students and they're coming in, there's oftentimes students that are working on like a project that somebody has a grant on and they're working on a funded project versus a student that might come in and has the what they want to work on already in place and are going to work to get the funding to do that. And it can often take students different amounts of time to get their PhD, depending on where their sources of funding are coming from. And so that's one way to get back into it too. You know, if you think about a project that really captures your interest, but it's already funded, and you know you can work well with that PI and as an advisor on that project, so that you can kind of check both the boxes of not having to really struggle to find funding or take extra semesters, get out in the field when you need to because it's already funded. That might be a way to go to make it a little bit like find things to make it easier for yourself, and don't think, oh no, I have to do it the hard way in order to be like hardcore with my PhD. Like there's no prize for making the hardest, the longest, the craziest font PhD, right? Get it done and move on into the job that you want to get.
Great. So our next question from Wihaki John. Hey, John, I know who this is. So he asks do you think the paucity of women in leadership positions demonstrates that having few women in science creates a lack of role models to attract and retain young women in scientific positions? And how can this be changed?
I think it's hard to get people there if the numbers are already low. But in addition, there's a body of literature that demonstrates that women and other historically excluded groups are less likely to self-nominate and less likely to ask other people to nominate them. And so, you know, that goes for awards as well as leadership positions. So if you're already starting at a disadvantage just because of the inherent bias in our communities and in the world, and then on top of it, you have some members who are feeling very confident about asking to be nominated or nominating themselves, and that's adding to the exclusion of some people, we need to be mindful of that. So all of us have the opportunity to nominate amazing women for some, awards, or to, nominate them for leadership roles. And so it's upon all of us to make sure that those things are starting to reflect society at large.
And I just want to reiterate the importance of role models. Like, as I did my undergrad at Cornell, I didn't have any Black ED professors the whole time I was there. There was no Black faculty at Scripps, none in my department at UC Davis, past or present. And so it's hard to imagine yourself in a role where you don't see anybody, who has a similar experience as you, in those positions. And so I think creating more spaces, bringing more diversity into this will, have this effect of, people feeling like, oh, someone has been successful who's, walking a mile in my shoes, I can do it because I can see that they've done it. If you can see it, you can be it is, how we started this panel off. And that's just, it's really important to, for us to start making those tracks to get those role models out there and visible.
Great, thank you. I think we have one more question in the Q&A box here. So this is, how do you all combat the challenges of science being politicized? So this questioner is a public school teacher, and there's an ongoing political debate about evolution itself being taught in schools, as well as the idea that representation in science is a, quote, liberal left idea. So this person's fortunate to work in a city with very diverse children, but she imagines it's not that way everywhere. So any of you have thoughts on sort of increasing politicization of either science or the idea of diversifying that you want to speak to?
I'll just say that there's a few things that come through my mind immediately when I hear this. And the first of which is that there's no corner of any part of our brains or society that is not sort of politicized, right? We live in the society that we're embedded in. We respond to how it's sort of reacting to the things that are going on around us. So to act like science is this pure tower where we don't actually notice what's happening broadly in society is ridiculous. But on top of it, I've never understood this whole argument about whether evolution should be taught in biology classes. We're there to present the data. We're there to present science and what the scientific community believes is the foundations of how we understand the natural world, period. Now, if people feel like they need to present some sort of religious-based ideas, put that in the religion class. It should never go in a biology classroom. It has its place. If you want to learn about that, sure, go to your religion class, but keep the science based on what the data and the research is telling us. Now, whether we should actually have representation included, absolutely. I think Vicky's brought up many sort of scenarios in which we need to have role models, we need to have representation. And whether it's sort of a liberal versus not perspective, that does not matter. We know that scientists look like all of us and more. And so why not just reflect what's actually going on in the real world?
I struggle with this a lot, anonymous attendee, especially in my role as Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion. And when the executive order came out in December or November, I guess, that we were no longer allowed to do certain types of career development focused on that was designed to help people understand how their identity was impacting their decisions that they were making and the biases that we see in our academia. It was really hard to try to think about the ways to create change in an environment that is resistant to that change. And I also saw this with intelligent design, as Corey was saying, if it's religious, it's religious, but intelligent design was coming in as a new science. And so how do you stand on a podium and say, like, you can't have a debate when both sides aren't willing to actually engage in a dialogue. And if one side is assuming that it's right and the other side is wrong, then there's no place that you can then there's no space to have that dialogue, which was what's really essential. And so we need to find ways to dialogue across differences. We need to find ways to be able to say, okay, what values are you bringing into this? Why do you think the liberal left is so bad? What is the real issue? Are you afraid that that people of color are going to take your job away? Are you afraid of, what is the issue that is underlying this sense of fear about evolution and fear about the non-homogenized academia that we currently have today? And I've heard a lot of really interesting fears that come out when you get to that point. I don't want my children to be taught that they're bad for being white. I don't want my, and you start to say, okay, well, that's not what's happening. And you can start to try to explain things. But it is a real challenge to try to come up with where people are finding that the barriers to come into an understanding of both science being an important part of how policies are made and a critical part to policy, and that science is better when we have diverse perspectives. And you can only achieve excellence in scientific research and thinking and teaching through having diverse voices, diverse perspectives, and diverse individuals at the table.
Great, thanks so much, Chelsea and Corey. So I think there's one more question that's in the chat box. So this is from Chuck Davis. So how can we make sure that the research environment is a safe space where women across different axes of diverse voices can be heard? Any of you have parting thoughts on the research environment?
Yeah, so we think about this a lot, and what I do with the dean at UC Davis is like, how do we make the environments that we're trying to add diversity to, how do we make it more welcoming to diversity? And a lot of that has to do with just like engaging in anti-racist work or trainings, or just understanding how to communicate with people and have good discourse with people who have a different background. And so I think training is a big aspect of that. And then empathy is important too, learning about, differences and how someone grew up and, trying to empathize with their position, I think is important. But I think a big aspect of that is like the training and the anti-racist work, which is an ongoing effort that, we all should be participating in.
Great, well, we had been aiming to wrap up around 7:30 and we are just about there. So a few folks have made, oh, go ahead, Chelsea.
Well, I just want to say there was a question that was in the Q&A that I put a resource on and it got moved to answered.
Oh,
so
okay.
I just wanted to not have that.
That's great, actually. So I was just no, that's perfect, because what I was just about to say was that a few people have shared resources in various places. So you anticipated what I was just about to say. So so Liz Zimmer and a few other folks in questions and comments have shared some resources, and I'm going to put these slowly into the chat box, into the main chat box, so that hopefully everyone will be able to see them and go take a look at these. So I'm going to do that right now. So this includes things like Diversify EEB, which has come up a few times tonight. The Bearded Lady Project is another fun paleo-oriented project that you can go and check out. And then the final two links down there are focused on diversity, and Academics for Black Lives was started last summer by some faculty at my institution at the University of Florida. So I've got to give them a shout out. So these are some resources that I hope you all will go and check out. They're very relevant to the discussions tonight. Looks like there's also Advanced Geo, and there's a couple more down there, some Nature articles. I'm not sure if I'll be able to get these pasted over, but I can try here.
Maybe to give Emily a moment to paste.
I know, yeah, I'm like, my fingers are moving fast here. I think I've got all of them. Maybe there's one more right here. So I think this is all of them. Okay, great. So yeah, thanks to all of you for participating tonight. This has been really wonderful. I'm really honored to have been a small part of this. And the recording here is going to be posted online, along with all the comments and the chats on the Darwin Days website for PRI and the museum. So feel free to revisit this, and especially go back to the screen that Vicki posted earlier in her slides with all those people, because I want to see Wikipedia pages for every single one of them. Yeah, so thank you all, and I think we can probably say goodnight now.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.